The date was November 7th, 1876. It was a night that would determine the future of the United States, but not for the reason you might think. Across the country, millions of Americans were anxiously counting votes. It was election night, the race between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, one of the most heated political battles the nation had ever seen. The telegraph wires were buzzing with numbers and accusations of fraud. But in the quiet town of Springfield, Illinois, just outside the city limits, a very different kind of count was taking place. At the Oak Ridge Cemetery, the darkness was absolute. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and a cold wind swept through the naked branches of the oak trees. Standing tall in the gloom was a magnificent monument made of granite and bronze, the final resting place of the 16th President, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had been dead for 11 years. He was the savior of the Union, the Great Emancipator, a martyr who belonged to the ages. To the American people, his tomb was sacred ground. To the three men creeping through the grass toward the monument, it was nothing more than a bank vault, and the body inside was the currency. They were not ghosts. They were grave robbers. But they weren't stealing the body for medical science or dark rituals. They were stealing it for ransom. Inside the tomb's rotunda, the air was stale and cold. Two men, Jack Hughes and Terrence Mullen, stood nervously by the heavy sarcophagus. Their hands shook, not just from the cold, but from the terrifying reality of what they were about to do. A third man, Louis Sveggles, held a lantern, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows against the marble walls. "Hurry up," Hughes whispered, his voice cracking. "The moon will be out soon." Mullen jammed a crowbar under the lid of the sarcophagus. Metal screeched against marble, a sound that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. They froze, listening for the footsteps of the cemetery custodian. Silence returned. They pushed again. The heavy lid began to slide. Inside lay a cedar coffin, and inside that, a lead-lined casket containing the man who had freed the slaves. They weren't there to pay respects. They were there to drag the President of the United States out into the night, stuff him into a wagon, and disappear into the darkness. But as they worked, they did not know that the darkness was watching them back. They did not know that the man holding the lantern was not who he claimed to be. And they certainly did not know that surrounding the tomb, hidden behind the tombstones, with revolvers drawn, were the agents of the United States Secret Service, waiting for the signal to open fire. This is the story of the most audacious, foolish, and desperate crime in American history. To understand how we ended up in a tomb with 3 criminals and a president, we must leave the graveyard and travel north, to the smoke-filled saloons of Chicago, where the plan was hatched. To understand the crime, you must understand the criminal underworld of 1876. The Civil War was over, but the war for money was raging in the streets of Chicago. In the late 19th century, Chicago was a chaotic, booming metropolis. It was a city rebuilding itself from the Great Fire of 1871, a place of industry, mud, and corruption. And at the heart of its criminal empire was a man named Big Jim Kennelly. Big Jim was not a grave robber by trade. He was a counterfeiter, a coney man in the slang of the day. He ran a livery stable as a front, but his real business was flooding the Midwest with fake currency. In those days, the United States had a chaotic money system. There were greenbacks, gold coins, silver coins, and banknotes. It was a paradise for forgers. Kennelly was the boss of the Hub, a saloon on West Madison Street that served as the headquarters for his gang. The Hub was a place where the air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of stale beer.
It was where thieves, con artists, and desperate men came to find work. But in early 1876, Big Jim Kennelly had a serious problem. His empire was crumbling. The problem wasn't the police. The local police could often be bought. The problem was the United States Secret Service. Today we know the Secret Service as the bodyguards of the president. But in 1876, that was not their job. The Secret Service had been created in 1865 for one specific purpose: to destroy counterfeiters. They were relentless, they were federal, and they were hunting Big Jim's operation. The Secret Service had struck a fatal blow to Kennelly's gang. They hadn't caught Big Jim yet, but they had caught the most important man in his organization, Benjamin Boyd. Ben Boyd was not a thug. He was an artist. He was a master engraver, perhaps the best in the entire country. Boyd could take a copper plate and carve the face of a president or the intricate scroll work of a $20 bill with such precision that even bank tellers couldn't tell the difference. Without Boyd, there were no plates. Without plates, there was no fake money. Without fake money, Big Jim's empire was worthless. The Secret Service had arrested Ben Boyd in 1875. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in the Joliet State Penitentiary. For Big Jim Kennelly, this was a disaster. His supply of high-quality fake bills dried up instantly. His distributors were angry. His income was vanishing. He tried to find other engravers, but none had the golden touch of Boyd. Their work was sloppy, easily detected, and dangerous to pass. Big Jim needed Ben Boyd back. But how do you get a man out of a maximum security prison? You can't bribe the warden of Joliet. You can't stage a prison break with a handful of street thugs. Big Jim sat in the back room of the hub, brooding over a glass of whiskey. He needed leverage. He needed something so valuable, so precious to the American government and the American people that they would trade anything to get it back. He needed a hostage. But kidnapping a living politician was too messy. They screamed, they fought, and they required food and water. No, Big Jim realized, a living hostage was too much trouble. He needed a hostage that wouldn't complain. A hostage that was already famous. The idea didn't come to him all at once. It formed slowly, born out of a drunken conversation about granite and marble. The state of Illinois had just finished building a massive new monument for Lincoln in Springfield. It was the talk of the newspapers. Kennelly's eyes narrowed as he formulated the plan. It was madness, but it was brilliant in its simplicity. He would go to Springfield. He would break into the tomb. He would steal the body of Abraham Lincoln. And then he would send a ransom note to the governor of Illinois and the President of the United States. The terms would be simple: $200,000 in cash and a full pardon for Benjamin Boyd. He told his men, they won't refuse. Lincoln is their god. They'll pay anything to get his bones.
Having a plan is one thing. Executing it is another. Big Jim Kennelly was a mastermind, but he was smart enough not to do the dirty work himself. He needed a crew. Unfortunately for history, but fortunately for Abraham Lincoln, the men Kennelly chose were not exactly professionals. They were closer to a comedy act. First, there was Terrence Mullen. He was the owner of the Hub Saloon, a man with a thick mustache and a temper, but very little in the way of brains. Mullen considered himself a tough guy, a sophisticated criminal, but he was mostly a small-time barkeeper who liked to talk big. Then there was Jack Hughes. Hughes was a counterfeiter, or at least he tried to be. He was nervous, excitable, and not particularly strong. He had a reputation for fumbling simple jobs. These were the men Kennelly entrusted with the theft of the century. In the summer of 1876, Kennelly called them into the back room. He laid out the plan. Mullen and Hughes listened, their mouths open.
Steal Lincoln? It sounded like a joke, but Connolly was deadly serious. He promised them a massive cut of the $200,000. Greed is a powerful motivator. Mullen and Hughes agreed. But there was a problem. Neither Mullen nor Hughes knew anything about grave robbing. They didn't know how to pick a lock, they didn't know how heavy a lead-lined coffin was, and they didn't know the layout of the cemetery in Springfield. They needed a third man, someone who knew his way around the dark alleys, someone with experience in snatching bodies. They began to ask around the Chicago underworld. They were looking for a roper, someone who could help with the heavy lifting and the logistics. And that is when they made their fatal mistake. They found a man named Louis Swegels. Swegels was a small, wiry man with a rough face and a convincing story. He told Mullen and Hughes that he was a horse thief with plenty of experience. He claimed he was tough, reliable, and ready for a big score. Mullen and Hughes liked him immediately. He seemed eager. He asked the right questions. What they didn't know was that Louis Swegels was a professional snitch. Swegels had been working as a paid informant for the Secret Service for months. He had infiltrated the counterfeiting rings of Chicago to feed information to the authorities. When Mullen and Hughes approached him and whispered about stealing old Abe, Swegels didn't laugh. He kept a straight face, expressed interest, and then ran as fast as he could to the office of Patrick Tyrrell. Patrick Tyrrell was the chief of the Chicago district of the Secret Service. He was a hard man, an Irish immigrant who had served in the Union Army during the Civil War. He hated counterfeiters with a passion. When Swegels burst into his office and told him that a gang was planning to kidnap the body of Abraham Lincoln, Tyrrell was skeptical. It sounded too insane to be true. But as Swegels explained the details, the demand for Ben Boyd's release, the connection to Big Jim Connolly, Tyrrell realized this was real. Tyrrell saw an opportunity. He wouldn't just stop the crime, he would catch them in the act. He told Swegels to play along. "Stick with them," Tyrrell ordered. "Become part of the gang. Do whatever they say, but tell me everything." And so the stage was set. The bumbling thieves, the mastermind, and the double agent began their preparations. They decided that the perfect time to strike would be election night, November 7th. They figured the whole country would be distracted by the vote counting. The town of Springfield would be empty, everyone glued to the telegraph offices or celebrating in the streets. The tomb would be unguarded. As the leaves turned brown and the winds of October began to blow, the conspirators packed their bags. They loaded a wagon with tools, a crowbar, a saw, and a lantern. They also packed a long sack intended to hold the body of the Great Emancipator. They boarded a train for Springfield, unaware that on the very same train, sitting just a few cars back, was Patrick Tyrrell and a team of highly armed agents. The train chugged south through the Illinois prairie, carrying a bizarre cargo of heroes and villains towards a rendezvous with history. The train arrived in Springfield, Illinois on the morning of November 6th. The town was buzzing. Flags draped from balconies, and the streets were filled with men in bowler hats debating the election. Rutherford Hayes versus Samuel Tilden. It was close, too close. The tension in the air was electric, which was perfect for the conspirators. In the chaos of democracy, no one noticed three men stepping off the train with a sinister purpose. Terrence Mullen and Jack Hughes walked with their heads down, trying to look inconspicuous. Louis Swegels, the double agent, walked with them, his heart pounding against his ribs. He knew that somewhere in the crowd behind them, Chief Patrick Tyrrell was watching. They checked into a cheap boarding house. Mullen, trying to act the leader, gave the orders. "We rest today, we scout the tomb tonight, we take him tomorrow on election night." Meanwhile, Patrick Tyrrell was moving fast. He didn't just have to catch the thieves, he had to protect the body. If a stray bullet hit the president's corpse during the arrest, Tyrrell's career, and likely his life, would be over. He went straight to the Oak Ridge Cemetery to find the custodian, a man named John Carroll. John Power was a strange character. He was obsessed with Lincoln. He lived in a small house right next to the monument and spent his days giving tours and polishing the marble. When Tyrrell knocked on his door and flashed his Secret Service badge, Power nearly fainted. "They want to do what?" Power gasped, his face turning pale. "They are coming tomorrow night," Tyrrell said grimly. "We need to set a trap. I need you to let them break in." Power was horrified, but he agreed to help. He showed Tyrrell the layout of the tomb. The monument was not just a grave, it was a fortress. At the base was a heavy iron door leading to the catacomb, the small chamber where the sarcophagus stood. Behind that was a labyrinth of dark, damp corridors used for ventilation and storage. "We will hide in the back," Tyrrell decided, "in the memorial hall. We'll wait until they actually touch the coffin. We need to catch them in the act of a felony." The stage was set, but as with all best-laid plans, things began to go wrong immediately. On the night of November 7th, the weather turned against them. A thick fog rolled in over Springfield, followed by a cold, biting wind. The moon vanished. At the boarding house, Mullen and Hughes were drinking to calm their nerves. They had their tools ready, a heavy axe, a saw to cut the padlock, and a crowbar. But they had a logistical problem. They needed a horse and wagon to carry the body. They sent Sweggles to rent one. Sweggles, playing his part, went to a local livery stable, but he was so nervous that he aroused suspicion. The stable owner refused to give him a horse.
He found another stable, told a lie about needing to move a sick grandmother, and finally secured a rickety wagon with a tired old horse. By the time he returned to Mullen and Hughes, it was late. The streets were emptying. The election results were still coming in over the telegraph wires, but the town was going to sleep. "It's time," Mullen said. They climbed onto the wagon seat. The wooden wheels clattered loudly on the cobblestones as they headed north, toward the black silhouette of the cemetery gates. While the thieves were traveling, the lawmen were already in position. Patrick Tyrrell had assembled a strike team. It was a motley crew. He had a few private detectives, a former police chief, and the terrified custodian, John Power. They made their way to the tomb an hour before midnight. To get into their hiding spot, they had to walk through the main chamber. They passed the white marble sarcophagus of Lincoln. In the flickering light of a single lantern, the name Lincoln, carved in the stone, seemed to glow. The men took off their hats in reverence. They moved into the memorial hall, a room directly behind the burial chamber. There was no door separating the two rooms, only a metal gate which they left slightly ajar. "Lights out," Tyrrell whispered. They extinguished their lanterns. Total darkness swallowed them. It was the kind of darkness that hurts the eyes. They were standing in a tomb, feet away from a dead president, waiting for criminals. The silence was absolute, broken only by the dripping of water from the condensation on the stone walls. They waited and waited. 1 hour passed, then 2. The cold seeped into their bones. One of the private detectives, a man named McGinn, was getting jumpy. He had brought a Colt revolver, and in the dark, every shadow looked like a monster. "Where are they?" someone whispered. "Quiet," Tyrrell hissed. Suddenly, a sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was metal on metal, the sound of a saw biting into iron. Outside the heavy oak doors of the tomb, Mullen was working on the padlock. He was sweating despite the cold. The lock was old and rusted, but it was tough. Hughes held the lantern, his hand shaking so badly the light danced wildly on the doorframe. Sweggles stood lookout, staring into the darkness, knowing his friends were hiding just on the other side of the wall. Snap! The padlock broke. The chain fell away with a clatter. Inside the tomb, the agent stiffened. Hands tightened on pistol grips, hearts hammered against ribs. The heavy doors creaked open.
A draft of fresh, cold air rushed into the stale tomb. Footsteps echoed on the marble floor. 1, 2, 3 sets of boots. "Get the lantern in here," Mullen's voice echoed in the chamber. It sounded distorted, ghostly. A beam of light cut through the gloom. From their hiding spot behind the iron gate, Tyrrell could see them. He saw the crowbar in Mullen's hand. He saw the nervous sweat on Hughes's face. They walked straight to the sarcophagus. "All right," Mullen said, looking at the massive marble block. "Let's get the lid off." The sarcophagus was not a simple box. It was a cedar coffin, inside a lead box, inside a wooden crate, inside a marble sarcophagus. The lid of the marble casing was sealed with plaster. Mullen jammed the crowbar into the seam. He grunted, putting his whole weight into it. "Help me, damn it!" he hissed at Hughes. Hughes grabbed the axe and tried to wedge it in. They pried and pushed. The plaster cracked. A cloud of white dust puffed into the air. "Push!" Mullen groaned. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy marble lid began to slide. Inch by inch, the cedar coffin inside was revealed. The agents in the back room held their breath. They were supposed to wait until the thieves actually moved the body. That was the law. Attempting to steal was one thing. Moving the body was the full crime. "It's too heavy," Hughes complained. "We can't lift the whole box." "We don't need the box," Mullen said, panting. "We just need the lead casket. We'll cut the end off this cedar box and slide the lead one out." They had exposed about a foot of the coffin. They were ready. Then Mullen stopped. He looked at Sweggles. "Go bring the wagon around," Mullen ordered. "Bring it right to the door. We're ready to load him up." This was the moment. Sweggles had to leave to get the wagon. This was the signal. He would walk out, and that would be the sign for Tyrrell to attack. "Right," Sweggles said. "I'll get the wagon." He turned and walked out of the tomb, his footsteps fading into the night. Mullen and Hughes were alone with the president. Inside the hiding spot, Patrick Tyrrell counted to 10. He wanted to give Sweggles enough time to get clear of the line of fire. "Now," Tyrrell whispered. "Go!" He kicked open the iron gate. "Surrender! You are surrounded!" Tyrrell roared, his voice booming in the small stone chamber. He rushed out into the main room, his revolver raised. He expected to see Mullen and Hughes freezing in terror. But the room was empty. Tyrrell skidded to a halt. The lantern was still sitting on the floor, casting long shadows. The sarcophagus lid was pushed back. The tools were scattered on the ground, but the thieves were gone. "They're outside!" Tyrrell shouted. "Get them!" The agents charged out of the tomb into the black night. What had happened? Mullen and Hughes, paranoid and jumpy, had heard the gate squeak or perhaps a footstep just seconds before Tyrrell yelled. They hadn't waited to ask questions. They had bolted out the door like rabbits. Outside, the cemetery was a chaotic scene of darkness and confusion. Tyrrell ran onto the terrace of the monument. He saw a shadow moving near the trees. "Halt!" Tyrrell screamed. The shadow didn't stop. Bang! Tyrrell fired his revolver. The muzzle flash lit up the night for a split second. Bang, bang! Other agents began firing. The shots cracked like thunder, echoing off the granite walls of the tomb. From the darkness, a voice cried out, "Don't shoot! It's me!" Tyrrell held his fire. "Who is me?" "McGinn," came the reply. It was one of his own detectives. In the confusion, the agents were shooting at each other. They were running in circles around the tomb, chasing shadows, firing blindly into the bushes. "Stop firing!" Tyrrell bellowed. "Cease fire!" Silence fell over the graveyard. The smoke from the black powder pistols hung in the damp air. They checked the grounds. They checked the bushes. They checked the wagon. Nothing. Mullen and Hughes had vanished into the fog, leaving their tools, their lantern, and the half-open grave of Abraham Lincoln behind. Tyrrell stood canting, his gun smoking in his hand. He looked at the empty wagon. He looked at the open tomb. He had saved the president's body, yes, but he had lost the criminals. The most important arrest of his life had turned into a fiasco. Or so he thought. He didn't know that Mullen and Hughes were not criminal masterminds. They were lost. They were currently stumbling through the woods of the cemetery, terrified, with no idea where they were going, and they were heading straight back toward town, straight back to the boarding house where the Secret Service had already planted another trap.
The sun rose over Springfield on November 8, 1876, casting a pale light on a city that was waking up to a new political reality. The election was still undecided. Hayes and Tilden were locked in a bitter dispute that wouldn't be resolved for months. But in the small boarding house on the edge of town, two men were waking up with a headache that had nothing to do with politics. Terrence Mullen and Jack Hughes were exhausted. After fleeing the cemetery, running blindly through the dark woods, and stumbling their way back to town, they had collapsed in their beds. They were terrified, but they were also confused. Who had shot at them? Was it the police? Was it a rival gang? Or was it just the cemetery watchman who had gotten lucky? They had no idea that they were already famous. Across town, Chief Patrick Tyrrell had not slept. He was furious. The botched raid at the tomb was a professional embarrassment, but he wasn't giving up. He knew where the rats lived. Tyrrell gathered his men. He didn't want a shootout this time. He wanted a clean arrest. They marched to the boarding house, their boots heavy on the wooden sidewalks. Upstairs, Mullen and Hughes were packing. They needed to get out of Springfield immediately. They were just buckling their bags when the door to their room exploded inward. Patrick Tyrrell stood in the doorway, his revolver leveled at Mullen's chest. Behind him stood a wall of agents. "Don't move," Tyrrell growled. Mullen blinked, looking at the gun, then at Hughes. There was no escape. The window was too high. The door was blocked. The master criminals who had planned to hold a president for ransom surrendered without a fight. As the handcuffs clicked around their wrists, Mullen looked around the room. "Where is Sveggles?" he asked. Tyrrell smiled, a cold, hard smile. "Mr. Sveggles is with us." The color drained from Mullen's face. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The betrayal, the trap. It had all been a setup from the very beginning. The trial of the Lincoln grave robbers became a national sensation. Newspapers across the country printed headlines about the ghouls who had tried to snatch the Great Emancipator. The public was outraged. People called for the death penalty. They wanted Mullen and Hughes to hang. But then, a strange legal reality came to light. In 1876, the laws of Illinois were written for a different time. There was a law against digging up a grave, yes, but the punishment for grave robbing was surprisingly light. It was considered a misdemeanor, punishable by no more than 1 year in jail. Furthermore, a dead body was not considered property in the eyes of the law. You couldn't steal a human being who was already dead because nobody owned them. The prosecutors were stumped. If they charged them with grave robbing, they would only get a year. That wasn't enough for such a heinous crime. So, they got creative. They charged Mullen and Hughes with conspiring to steal the coffin. The coffin, they argued, was property of the state, worth roughly $75. The trial was a circus, but the verdict was swift. Guilty. The judge threw the book at them, or at least the only book he had. He sentenced them to 1 year in the Joliet State Penitentiary. To the public, it was a slap in the wrist. 1 year for trying to steal Lincoln? It seemed like a joke. But for Mullen and Hughes, it was the end of their criminal careers. They served their time and faded into obscurity, forever known as the fools who tried to steal a giant. Big Jim Canally, the mastermind, was never convicted for the plot. He denied everything, and without Mullen and Hughes testifying against him, the police couldn't touch him. However, his counterfeiting empire collapsed, and he died a few years later, penniless and alone. But while the thieves went to jail, the real drama was just beginning back at the cemetery. The attempted theft had terrified John Carroll Power, the custodian of the tomb. He realized something chilling. The tomb was not safe.
If 3 incompetent fools could almost succeed, what would happen if professionals tried? The public thought Lincoln was back in his sarcophagus, safe and sound, but that was a lie. On the night after the attempted theft, John Carroll Power and a small group of trusted friends made a secret decision. They could not risk putting the body back in the white marble sarcophagus upstairs. It was too exposed. It was too easy to open. In the dead of night, while the rest of Springfield slept, 5 men entered the tomb. They carried the heavy cedar coffin containing the president not into the burial chamber, but deep into the labyrinth of the basement. The basement of the tomb was a dark, damp maze of brick corridors. It was cluttered with old wood, discarded construction materials, and dust. "Here," Power whispered, pointing to a spot near the foundation wall. "We hide him here." They placed the coffin on a stack of wood, just a few inches off the muddy floor. Then they covered it with old lumber, tarp, and debris. They made it look like a pile of trash. For the next 2 years, Abraham Lincoln, the savior of the Union, lay hidden under a pile of garbage in a damp basement. Only a handful of men knew the secret. They called themselves the Lincoln Guard of Honor. They swore an oath of secrecy. They visited the tomb regularly to check on the trash pile, ensuring that the dampness wasn't destroying the cedar box. For visitors, the experience was a strange deception. Thousands of people came to pay their respects. They would stand before the beautiful white marble sarcophagus in the upper chamber, weeping and praying, completely unaware that the box in front of them was empty. The real Lincoln was just a few feet below them.
Years passed. The paranoia of the Guard of Honor never faded. They moved the body several times within the tomb, always terrified that thieves would return. Finally, in 1901, Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's only surviving son, decided to end the madness. He had lived with the fear of his father's body being stolen for decades. He gave strict orders for a new, permanent burial. He did not want a lock. He did not want a door. He wanted a vault that could never be opened. On September 26, 1901, a small group gathered at the tomb for the final time. Among them were the surviving members of the Guard of Honor, now old men. They brought the coffin out from its hiding place. But before they buried him forever, they needed to be sure. Was he still there? Was it really him? A local plumber cut a small window into the lead lining of the coffin. A pungent, spicy smell arose, the smell of the embalming fluids used 36 years earlier. The men leaned in. There, perfectly preserved, was the face of Abraham Lincoln. His skin was bronze-colored from the unhealed bruise of the bullet and the chemicals, but his features were unmistakable. His black beard was still intact. His bow tie was crooked, just as he often wore it in life. "It is him," one of the men whispered, tears streaming down his face. They soldered the window shut. They lowered the coffin into a deep cage made of steel bars. Then, following Robert Todd Lincoln's instructions, they poured tons of wet concrete into the cage. The concrete flowed over the coffin, filling every inch of space, turning the grave into a solid block of stone and steel, 10 feet deep. As the concrete hardened, the men knew that the journey was finally over. The body of Abraham Lincoln was no longer just in a grave. He was part of the earth, encased in a fortress that no thief, no crowbar, and no dynamite could ever breach. The Lincoln Guard of Honor disbanded. Their watch was ended. And so the strange saga concluded. A plot born in a counterfeiter's saloon had ended with a president buried in a block of cement. It was a story of greed, incompetence, and ultimately a strange kind of devotion. Today, if you visit the Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, you will see the grand monument. You will see the marble room. But if you look down at the floor,
You are standing directly over that block of concrete, and you can know with absolute certainty that the man who saved the Union is finally, truly, at rest. History is often written by the victors, but sometimes it is shaped by the fools. If Mullen and Hughes had not been so clumsy, if Schwegels had not been a spy, the history of America might have been very different. But perhaps in the end there was a greater force at work. Perhaps some things and some men are simply too heavy to be stolen. This concludes the story of the plot to steal Lincoln's body,